Now on the board here I've got three headings here: metaphysics, epistemology, and values. And what I want to do is talk through in this introductory subunit on pragmatism the distinctively pragmatic way about thinking about metaphysics, epistemology, and value issues. And just by way of heading, what the pragmatists will say is that in metaphysics they are the first philosophy in the history of philosophy to take evolution seriously, and the timing is important here. Obviously, the realists and the idealists, as ancient philosophical systems, did not have modern evolution right at their disposal. It is true to say that there were some very early Greek theorists who had some proto-evolutionary type notions, but those were never very systematically developed. Evolutionary theory really is a modern phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon originally of the 19th century. Evolutionary ideas were in the air as the 19th century developed. The intellectual world is starting to think less in terms of timeless absolutes and an unchanging fabric and structure for the universe, and more thinking in terms of process and change, particularly in the biological world. And a lot of this culminates in Charles Darwin's work in 1859 with his publication of On the Origin of Species. Most of the first generation pragmatists, right, are of this generation. They are young men in their teen years or in their early 20s. Charles Peirce, born in 1839, I believe. William James a couple of years later in 1842 or so. Both of them would have been at the prime young point of their intellectual development when Origin of Species bursts onto the scene, but nonetheless they are born into a world and cut their intellectual teeth in a world that is already thinking seriously in evolutionary terms. John Dewey was born in 1859, the exact year that Origin of Species is published, and so then he is born into a world, an intellectual world that is in large part shaped by evolutionary thinking in Darwin's form. So evolution is then what the pragmatists will say that their philosophical system metaphysically is taking seriously, and taking seriously in a way that the realists and the idealists never did, and so on. Epistemologically, the pragmatists imbibe a strong dose of skepticism. There is not as skeptical as one can be. We'll see some of those developments later on in the semester, but nonetheless what they will say is that the idealists and the realists are fundamentally optimistic about the capacity of human beings to acquire knowledge. Of course, the idealists and the realists will disagree amongst themselves about how we acquire this absolute and certain knowledge about the nature of the universe, but nonetheless the assumption that they're both making is that absolute knowledge is possible, or certain knowledge is possible, or that truth, some sort of heavy-duty or epistemological concept, is achievable to us by human beings. Whether in strongly religious forms of idealism, it's because we have direct revelations from God, or if we're able to make a faith commitment and believe in an absolute truth on the basis of faith, or in more secular versions of idealism, if we do have this pure reason capacity to abstract and otherwise intuit our way to higher order truths, or if we are realists. The realists will be quite optimistic about the power of scientific method, if followed rigorously, to yield definite truths and absolutes about the nature of the natural world. The pragmatists are much more modest, to put it modestly, in their epistemological approach here, and so they will introduce a significant amount of skepticism in their epistemology, and that changes significantly how we think about knowledge. Finally, on value issues, while as I mentioned before, it is fair to say that the pragmatists do come, broadly speaking, I think, out of the realist tradition. They're much more naturalistic in their thinking. While they do have their qualifications, they do think scientific method is the best thing that we have going, and all of those things they then share with realism. Nonetheless, on value issues, they do diverge sharply from realism's individualism. The realists are both individualists in their cognitive orientation, arguing that it's the individual mind, individual observation, important for the individual to process his or her own knowledge and reach his or her own conclusions. The realists also are strongly individualistic in their value approach. It's the individual's liberty, the individual's pursuit of happiness. Individual self-responsibility is a core thesis. It's not to say, of course, that the realists aren't very social, right, as well, but they will argue that social groups ultimately are collections of individuals, and social groupings are put together for the purpose of individuals mutually, right, achieving various ends. With the pragmatists, that emphasis is shifted dramatically in the direction of the social. Not so much in the first generation pragmatists, but certainly by the time we get to the generation of John Dewey, who was the most long-lived and I think the most influential of all of the American pragmatists, and certainly the one who is by far the most influential on American education. What we find in Dewey's pragmatic philosophy is a heavy emphasis on the social values, the communal values, and Dewey's way of putting it is to emphasize, right, the concept of democracy, right, which we will see for him is not simply a more limited political notion of, we vote to decide who has power for a certain amount of time, but democracy becomes a deeper notion for him, that democracy is the way in which we figure out what our core values are as individuals and as communities, and democracy is also going to have some spillover epistemological issues. It's going to be through democratic procedures that we decide what counts as truth, what counts as knowledge, so conceived by pragmatism.